My name is Anna, and when I tell you I was born in the year 1632, you may pause for a moment and wonder what kind of world a child would have opened her eyes to at that time. I came into the world in England, in a small but bustling town where the air was often filled with the sound of merchants calling out their wares, the creaking of wooden carts rolling over cobblestone streets, and the chatter of neighbors who always seemed to know one another's business. My earliest memories are painted in shades of gray skies and rolling fields, of chimneys breathing smoke into the air, and of ships that carried not only goods, but also whispers of lands beyond the horizon. From the moment I could walk and speak, I was aware that life was both vast and uncertain. But inside the walls of my family's home, I found a sense of belonging and purpose that made the outside world seem less intimidating. I was not a child of poverty or hardship, as so many others were during that time. My father was a successful businessman, and because of his work, our family lived with a comfort that was not common to everyone in England. We had a home that stood tall with sturdy beams, wide windows, and rooms filled with light. The walls were lined with shelves of books, maps, and records that my father valued deeply, while my mother filled the house with warmth, laughter, and the aroma of freshly baked bread. Although I did not fully grasp the meaning of wealth when I was young, I understood that my life was surrounded by abundance and security, and that my parents had given me something many others longed for but never received. From an early age, I felt a natural curiosity about the world and my place in it. I remember walking through the halls of our house, running my fingers across the spines of my father's books, even though I could not yet read their titles. Each object in our home felt like it had a story to tell, and I wanted to listen to them all. I would often sit by the window with my sister and watch as travelers passed through the town, their clothes dusty from the road, their accents different from ours. I would imagine what it might be like to follow them, to see the places they had come from, to know their stories. That longing for understanding became part of who I was, a girl eager to learn, eager to ask, and eager to remember. But to understand me, you must also understand the world in which I was raised. England in the 1600s was a land of contrasts. On one hand, it was a nation of power, exploration, and opportunity. On the other, it was a place of deep divisions, uncertainty, and fear. The streets were crowded, sometimes dirty, and often dangerous, but they were also filled with the sound of new ideas and the sight of change. The echoes of war, religion, and politics were always present, though as a child, I only heard them as distant conversations carried by my father's friends who came to visit. To me, life was measured not by the struggles of the nation, but by the closeness of my family, the lessons I learned at home, and the dreams that grew quietly within me. I often think of my childhood as a series of seasons. Spring was always my favorite, when the gardens came alive with colors, and I could run barefoot in the grass with my siblings, feeling the cool earth beneath my feet. Summer was warm and filled with gatherings, with neighbors sharing meals outdoors and musicians filling the night with song. Autumn, though, was a quieter time, a season of work when my father spent more time in his business and my mother taught us how to prepare for the cold. Winter was harsh and demanding, the wind biting against our skin, but inside, by the fireplace, I felt the deepest sense of belonging. These seasons shaped not only the rhythm of my childhood, but also the way I came to see life itself, an ever-changing cycle of joy, labor, and rest. When I look back, I see myself as a young girl with long brown hair and eyes that my mother used to say could hold both questions and answers. I was not the boldest of children, nor the quietest. I stood somewhere in between, always listening but also eager to share what I had observed. I loved to sit with my mother in the kitchen, watching her hands move gracefully as she prepared meals. And I loved to follow my father into his study, where he would often allow me to sit quietly while he worked. Even in silence, I felt like I was part of something larger, part of a story that stretched beyond the walls of our home. Though I was born into comfort, I was not shielded from hardship entirely. The world outside my door was not always kind, and I saw the struggles of others. There were children my age who had no shoes, who worked long hours in fields or shops, whose faces were marked by hunger and weariness. I remember once asking my mother why they lived that way while we lived so differently, and she told me gently, "Because life is not equal, Anna. But what we are given, we must use with kindness." Those words stayed with me, shaping how I saw myself in relation to others. I learned that privilege was not simply a blessing, but also a responsibility. And even though I was young, I carried that truth within me. As I grew older, I began to notice the weight of my father's role in our lives. He was not just a man who provided wealth. He was the foundation of our family's reputation and future. He worked with dedication, often traveling or meeting with other men of influence, and though his presence was sometimes scarce, it was always strong. My mother, meanwhile, gave me the softer lessons, the patience of love, the care of a family, the importance of gentleness in a world that could be so harsh. Together, they created a balance that shaped me into the person I was becoming. But even with all that I had, I sometimes felt the stirrings of restlessness inside me. There was a part of me that wanted to know more, to go beyond the boundaries of our town, to see the lands that were spoken of in my father's maps and in the stories of travelers. I wondered what it might mean to step away from the life that had been prepared for me and to carve out my own. Yet at the same time, I felt the pull of family, the duty of loyalty, and the comfort of the familiar. It was this tension between curiosity and belonging that defined so much of my early years. Still, at the center of it all was my identity. I was Anna, daughter of a German father and an English mother, a girl of mixed heritage who grew up with the richness of two cultures. I carried within me the discipline of my father and the tenderness of my mother. And though I did not fully understand it then, these qualities would guide me through the many trials and choices that lay ahead. Looking back on those years, I see not only the innocence of my youth, but also the seeds of the person I would one day become. I was a child who lived in both privilege and awareness, who dreamed of the world while being rooted in the love of family. My story began in England in 1632, but it did not end there. The experiences of my childhood were only the first chapter. The introduction to a life shaped by my family's history, my parents' values, and the ever-present desire to understand who I was meant to be. And so, when I speak of myself, I cannot separate who I am from the people who gave me life. My father with his sharp mind and steady work, my mother with her gentle heart and wisdom, and my siblings with whom I shared laughter and lessons, all of them form the backdrop of my existence. To know me is to know them, for they were the soil in which I was planted. And as I take you further into my story, it becomes clear that my identity is not only my own, but also a reflection of where I came from, of the heritage that shaped me, and of the family that defined my earliest years. This, then, is where my story begins, with a girl named Anna, born into comfort yet filled with questions, living in a time of change yet grounded by love. And as I tell you more about my journey, the next step is to turn to the two people who stood at the center of it all. My parents, whose lives and choices would leave an indelible mark on who I became. To understand who I became, you must first understand the two people who brought me into this world, for in every way their lives shaped the foundation of mine. My father and mother were not only my parents, they were the living embodiment of two different lands, two different histories, and two very different ways of seeing the world. Their union was not only the reason for my existence, but also the lens through which I came to view life itself. My father was a German by birth, a man whose presence carried both authority and quiet dignity. Though he had settled in England by the time I was born, his accent never left him entirely, and I can still recall the cadence of his words. Slightly heavier, yet deliberate and steady, as if each syllable mattered. He was born into a family that valued discipline and hard work, and those values were carved into his very character. I remember him as a man who rarely wasted time, whose days were structured with precision, and whose eyes seemed always fixed on a horizon that others could not see. My father was not simply a businessman in the practical sense. He was a visionary, someone who understood that wealth was not merely the result of labor, but of foresight, risk, and determination. The story of how he came to England was one I heard many times, though each telling carried a slightly different shade depending on who was speaking. As a young man, he had grown restless in Germany, where opportunities were limited for someone of his ambition. The weight of tradition pressed heavily there, and though his family was respectable, they could not offer him the kind of future he longed for. England, by contrast, was a nation alive with trade, exploration, and enterprise. Ships left its ports for lands unknown, goods passed through its cities in staggering amounts, and men who dared to take chances could find themselves climbing from obscurity to prominence. My father, seeing this, chose to leave behind the familiar fields and villages of his youth and to carve out a life in this new land of opportunity. When I was old enough to ask him about those early days, he would sometimes smile and shake his head as if even he could not believe how far he had come. He told me of the loneliness of being a stranger in a foreign land, of the struggle to master a new language, and of the countless nights he spent working long hours with little reward. But he also told me of the resilience those years gave him, how they taught him to survive, to adapt, and eventually to thrive. "Anna," he once said, placing his hand on my shoulder, "if you ever feel lost, remember that even the strongest trees begin as seeds in foreign soil." Those words sank deeply into me, and I often thought of them whenever I faced moments of uncertainty in my own life. My mother, in contrast, was as English as the rolling hills and misty mornings that surrounded our town. She was born into a family that, while not wealthy, was known for its good name, its honesty, and its strong sense of community. Where my father embodied structure and ambition, my mother carried warmth, compassion, and grace. She was the kind of woman whose presence could quiet a room not by force but by gentleness. Her voice was soft, yet steady, her smile constant, and her eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. She was, in many ways, the counterbalance to my father's intensity. While he charted futures and planned carefully for every possibility, she grounded us in the present, reminding us of the value of kindness, love, and patience. Her upbringing had been modest but filled with love. She grew up helping her mother tend to the home and learning the quiet but necessary skills that made a household flourish: sewing, cooking, and caring for others. But she also carried a curiosity for learning, for reading, and for understanding the world. When she met my father, she was drawn to his determination and his vision, qualities that were unlike many of the men she had known before. He, in turn, was captivated by her kindness, her ability to see not only what a man did, but who he was. Their marriage was not one arranged by duty or necessity, but one chosen by the heart, and that choice was something they carried into every day of their life together. Together, my parents built a home that was both structured and warm, ambitious, yet filled with tenderness. From my father, I learned the value of work, discipline, and foresight. From my mother, I learned the importance of compassion, patience, and love. They were not perfect, of course. No parents are. But the balance they created between themselves gave us, their children, a life that was rich in both security and affection. I remember evenings when my father would return from a long day of business. He would remove his heavy coat, hang it by the door, and sit in his study to review ledgers and accounts. The candlelight would cast long shadows on the walls, and though I often longed to speak with him, I knew not to interrupt until he had finished. My mother, meanwhile, would sit with us in the kitchen, telling us stories while preparing supper. Her stories were often simple ones, of her own childhood, of neighbors we knew, or of lessons she wanted us to carry. But the way she told them made them linger in our hearts. When my father finally joined us at the table, the two of them would exchange a glance, sometimes a smile, that spoke of a bond deeper than words. But their backgrounds, as different as they were, sometimes created moments of tension. My father's strict German discipline occasionally clashed with my mother's softer English sensibilities. He demanded punctuality, precision, and effort, while she believed in flexibility, understanding, and forgiveness. I remember once being scolded by my father for neglecting my studies, only for my mother to quietly remind him that I was still a child, and that play had its place as much as work. These differences, though they sometimes caused arguments, also made their partnership strong. They balanced each other, and in that balance, they created a family environment where we children could see both sides of life, the importance of striving and the importance of living. As a child, I often found myself trying to reconcile these two influences within myself. I wanted to be disciplined, hardworking, and focused like my father, but I also longed to be gentle, understanding, and free like my mother. It took me many years to realize that I did not have to choose between them, that I was, in fact, the sum of both, carrying their qualities within me in ways that would guide me for the rest of my life. When I think of their love story, I cannot help but marvel at the courage it must have taken for my father to leave his homeland, and for my mother to choose a man so different from those she had grown up with. Their union was not only a merging of two people, but also a blending of two cultures, two traditions, and two ways of seeing the world. In their marriage, I learned that love is not about sameness, but about complementing one another, about finding balance in differences and strength in unity. Their backgrounds also influenced the way we were raised as children. My father insisted on education, not only in reading and writing, but in understanding the world beyond our town. He would bring home maps and point out faraway places, telling us of the opportunities that lay in distant lands. My mother, meanwhile, ensured that we were not only educated but also kind, reminding us that knowledge without compassion was empty. She encouraged us to help our neighbors, to share what we had, and to treat every person with dignity, no matter their station. These lessons, though different in emphasis, created in me a sense of balance that I would carry into adulthood. As I grew, I came to see how their backgrounds shaped not only me but also my siblings. My brothers often leaned more toward my father's discipline, eager to prove themselves in work and responsibility, while my sister reflected more of my mother's gentleness and patience. Together, the four of us carried forward the legacies of both parents, though each of us in our own way. But what stands out most to me when I think of my parents is not simply their differences or their strengths, but the way they chose, every day, to build a life together. In a time when many marriages were dictated by necessity or arrangement, theirs was a union built on choice, love, and respect. And in that, they gave us not only a home, but also an example of what it meant to build a life worth living. Even now, as I recall their story, I feel the weight of their legacy within me. My father's courage to leave behind the familiar, my mother's ability to bring warmth and stability to any situation. These qualities became the compass points by which I navigated my own life, and though they came from different lands, different traditions, and different ways of being, together they created something greater than themselves, a family, a home, and a legacy that still lives on in me. And so, when I tell my story, I cannot separate it from theirs. To know who I am, you must know who they were. For it was in the blending of their two lives, German determination and English grace, that I found my own identity, my own balance, and my own place in the world. This is the story of my parents, the two people whose union gave me life and whose backgrounds shaped the very fabric of who I became. And as my story continues, it moves naturally to the bond I shared with those who walked beside me through childhood, my siblings, who were not just companions, but co-authors of the earliest chapters of my life. If my parents were the roots of my life, then my siblings were the branches that stretched out beside me, shaping the direction of my childhood and coloring my memories with the companionship, rivalry, and lessons that only brothers and sisters can give. I was not an only child, nor was I left to wander the halls of our home in silence. From my earliest moments, I shared my days, my thoughts, my laughter, and sometimes my tears with the three people who were closest to me: my two brothers and my sister. To tell my story truthfully, I must tell you about them, for without their presence, my life would have been quieter, lonelier, and far less meaningful. My eldest brother, whose name was Richard, was the firstborn of the family and carried himself with the natural authority that often comes with such a position. From a young age, he seemed destined to follow in my father's footsteps, not only because he admired him, but also because he possessed the same sharp mind and unwavering sense of discipline. Richard was serious where I was curious, firm where I was flexible, and sometimes stern in a way that made him feel older than his years. He took his role as the eldest seriously, often reminding us, his younger siblings, of the standards we were meant to uphold and the duties we must not neglect. Yet beneath his seriousness lay a loyalty that never wavered. He might scold me for neglecting my lessons or tease me when I stumbled over words, but if anyone outside our family dared to insult me or my sister, he was the first to rise in our defense. He was, in many ways, the shield of our family, carrying the weight of expectation and duty with a determination that sometimes made me worry for him, yet also filled me with pride. Then there was Thomas, my second brother, who was as different from Richard as day is from night. If Richard was the embodiment of order, Thomas was the spirit of mischief. His eyes always carried a spark of humor, and his smile came easily, even in moments when others frowned. He was the brother who would sneak sweets from the kitchen when my mother's back was turned, who would coax me into games that left us breathless with laughter, and who could turn even the dullest of lessons into an adventure. Thomas was clever, though not always in the way that pleased my father. He could charm his way out of punishments, find shortcuts in his work, and weave stories so convincing that even I sometimes forgot they were not true. While Richard carried the weight of being the eldest, Thomas bore the gift of bringing lightness to our days, reminding us all that life, however serious it might seem, was also meant to be enjoyed. My sister, Elizabeth, was the youngest of us, 4, and though she was closest to me in age, she was also the one I felt most protective of. From the moment she was born, with her delicate features and soft cry, I felt as though it was my duty to watch over her, to guide her, and to shield her from the difficulties of the world. Elizabeth had a gentleness that mirrored my mother's, and even as a child, she carried within her a calmness that made others pause. Where I was often restless with questions, Elizabeth was content to observe, to listen, and to comfort. She was the one who would place her small hand in mine when I was afraid, the one who would sit beside me in silence when I felt troubled, and the one who, even in her youth, seemed to understand emotions that I could barely name. Though she was younger, she often seemed wiser, and her presence was a balm to us all. Growing up with 2 brothers and a sister meant that my days were rarely quiet. We filled the house with our voices, sometimes harmonious, sometimes clashing. There were arguments, of course. Who would get the better seat at the table? Who would have the first turn at a game? Who was responsible for a broken object? But beneath every quarrel lay the unspoken truth that we belonged to one another, and that no disagreement could sever the bond of blood and love that tied us together. The closeness of our family was not measured by the absence of conflict, but by the certainty that, no matter the quarrel, reconciliation would always follow. Our childhood games are still etched into my memory with vivid clarity. Richard, always the leader, would organize us into grand adventures that he had devised, turning the garden into a battlefield or a kingdom, assigning each of us roles to play. Thomas, true to his nature, would bend the rules or add twists to the game, often frustrating Richard but sending the rest of us into fits of laughter. I often found myself caught between them, admiring Richard's order but enjoying Thomas's unpredictability. Elizabeth, too young at times to fully participate, would sit nearby, watching us with her wide eyes, occasionally stepping in to play the role of a princess in need of rescue, or a wise figure who gave us advice in our imaginary world. Those games, though simple, taught us more than we realized. They showed us how to work together, how to navigate differences, and how to balance seriousness with playfulness. As we grew older, the dynamics among us shifted, as they always do with siblings. Richard grew more absorbed in preparing for the responsibilities that awaited him, spending more time with our father and less with us. I sometimes missed the days when he had been simply a brother, not yet weighed down by duty, but I understood that he was being shaped by expectations greater than himself. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to resist such expectations, often clashing with my father over his carefree ways. There were times when their arguments echoed through the house, my father demanding responsibility, Thomas insisting on freedom. I worried for him, yet I also admired his refusal to be molded into something he was not. Elizabeth remained the gentle thread that wove us all together, her quiet presence softening even the harshest disagreements. She had a way of speaking to Richard that reminded him to be kind, and a way of listening to Thomas that made him feel understood. To me, she was not only a sister but also a confidant, someone I could share my thoughts and fears with, knowing they would be held in the safety of her heart. There is something about growing up with siblings that shapes you in ways no other experience can. They are the mirrors in which you see yourself reflected, sometimes accurately, sometimes distorted, but always with a truth that cannot be denied. Through Richard, I learned the weight of responsibility and the importance of discipline. Through Thomas, I discovered the value of joy, laughter, and the courage to resist conformity. Through Elizabeth, I came to understand the quiet strength of compassion and the healing power of gentleness. Together, they formed the tapestry of my childhood, each thread unique yet inseparably woven with mine. One of my most cherished memories is of the winter evenings when the four of us would gather by the fire after supper. The world outside would be frozen and silent, but within the walls of our home, we created our own warmth. Richard would often read aloud, practicing his voice as though preparing for future speeches or responsibilities. Thomas would interrupt, with jokes or playful remarks, making Elizabeth and me laugh until tears filled our eyes. Elizabeth would sometimes sing softly, her voice blending with the crackle of the fire. And I, sitting among them, would feel an overwhelming sense of belonging, as if in those moments nothing else in the world mattered. Yet life was not always so simple. There were moments of loss, of fear, and of uncertainty, and in those times, our sibling bond was tested and strengthened. I remember one particularly harsh winter when illness swept through our town, taking the lives of many. We were fortunate to survive, but the fear that gripped us was real. I recall sitting by Elizabeth's bedside when she fell ill, holding her hand through sleepless nights, whispering prayers that she would recover. Richard took on the role of protector, ensuring that we were safe and provided for, while Thomas, though frightened, tried to keep us laughing so that despair would not take root. It was in those difficult days that I realized how deeply we relied on one another, how much our lives were intertwined. As we grew older still, the paths before us began to diverge. Richard's future was tied to my father's business, and he embraced that path with determination. Thomas dreamed of adventures beyond the confines of our home, speaking often of travel, of ships, and of lands far away. Elizabeth, though still young, showed signs of a life devoted to care, perhaps one day as a wife and mother, but already as a presence that brought comfort to others. And I, caught between them all, felt the pull of each path, uncertain where my own would lead, but certain that wherever it took me, the bond we shared would remain. Looking back now, I see that my siblings were not only companions of my childhood, but also the earliest teachers of my character. They showed me the many sides of human nature, strength and weakness, seriousness and play, kindness and stubbornness, and in them I saw reflections of myself. Without them, I would not have learned to navigate the complexities of relationship, to balance my desires with the needs of others, or to understand that love, in its truest form, is not always easy, but is always worth holding on to. And so, when I tell the story of my life, I cannot tell it without them. Richard, Thomas, and Elizabeth were not merely figures in the background. They were central to the narrative of who I became. They shaped my days, challenged my beliefs, comforted my fears, and reminded me again and again that family is both a gift and a responsibility. It is from here, from the bond I shared with my siblings, that the next part of my story naturally unfolds, for our closeness, our experiences, and even our quarrels were lived against the backdrop of the life our parents' work had provided us. To understand what it meant to grow up with Richard, Thomas, and Elizabeth, you must also understand the world we lived in, the wealth and lifestyle that surrounded us, the opportunities it gave, and the challenges it sometimes brought. And so my story continues, moving from the personal ties of siblinghood to the broader picture of the life we shared as a family in England during those years. When I look back on my childhood, one of the things that stands out most vividly in my memory is the lifestyle we enjoyed because of the wealth my father had built. It was not just the presence of money, but the comfort, opportunities, and security that came with it. My father's success in business meant that we lived in a way that was both respectable and comfortable, something that not every family in 1632 England could claim. At the time, many families struggled simply to put food on the table or to keep their homes warm in the cold winters. But for us, life looked very different. My father's work provided us with a large, well-kept home, the kind that drew attention, from travelers and neighbors alike. It had tall windows that let in the morning light, a sturdy roof, and enough rooms for each of us children to feel as though we had our own space to grow and dream. There were rugs on the wooden floors, paintings on the walls, and furniture that was carefully chosen to show both comfort and elegance. We had books, too, which were not common in every household, and I spent many evenings turning their pages, learning not only the lessons my father and mother taught me, but also ideas that stretched far beyond the walls of our home. Food was never scarce in our house, and in those times, that in itself was a sign of wealth. My mother took pride in the meals served at our table. We ate bread that was fresh and soft, meat that was seasoned with care, and fruit that was brought from nearby markets when it was in season. While others around us sometimes had to make do with little, our plates were always full, and I knew, even as a child, that this was because of my father's determination and skill in business. I remember watching him at the table, the way he carried himself with confidence, and I admired how people respected him not only for his money, but also for his wisdom. He often reminded us that wealth was not meant for showing off, but for building a strong and secure life. Still, I cannot deny that I felt a quiet pride when people looked at our family and admired the way we lived. Our clothing also reflected our comfortable life. While children from poorer families wore clothes patched over many times, mine were well-fitted, clean, and chosen carefully by my mother. She had an eye for detail, and she believed that the way a person dressed was a reflection of their character. My brothers wore sturdy coats and boots, while my sister and I wore dresses that allowed us to move freely but also looked elegant when guests visited. There was always an emphasis on modesty and neatness, but beneath that was a clear sign that we lived differently from those who had less. I never forgot that difference, and sometimes it made me curious about how others lived without the security I knew so well. The neighborhood we lived in also showed the kind of life we had. Our home stood among other respectable houses, and we were surrounded by families who also valued education, good manners, and trade. My father often said that wealth was not only about money, but about the community you built around yourself, and he chose to keep company with people who were ambitious, hardworking, and respectable. This gave me a chance to grow up around conversations that were filled with ideas about business, travel, and the wider world. As a young girl, I would listen quietly when men spoke of ships crossing seas, of new goods arriving from far-off lands, or of challenges faced in markets. These conversations sparked my imagination, and though I did not fully understand them at the time, they planted a seed in me that would grow into a deep curiosity about the world beyond England. Travel was another aspect of our lifestyle that revealed our wealth. Though we did not sail across oceans as some families did, we often took journeys within England. My father believed that travel was a way to open one's mind and to learn about different ways of living. We rode in carriages drawn by strong horses, carrying us to towns and cities where we could see new markets, visit relatives, or explore places of history. These trips were always exciting for me, as they broke the rhythm of our daily lives and gave me a chance to see life beyond our familiar streets. I still remember the feeling of anticipation each time the carriage wheels began to turn, the sound of the horses' hooves against the ground, and the way my heart raced at the thought of what new sights I would see. Education was also a privilege that wealth brought to us. While many children my age grew up without learning to read or write, my siblings and I were given the chance to study. My father hired tutors who came to our home, men who taught us not only the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also history, geography, and even philosophy. My mother, too, played a role in our learning. She taught us the values of kindness, discipline, and faith, reminding us that knowledge without character was empty. Because of this education, I grew up with an awareness of the world that many young girls did not have at that time. I realized early on how rare this opportunity was, and though I was young, I treasured it deeply. Yet wealth and comfort did not mean we were free of challenges. My father often reminded us that having money meant having responsibility. People looked up to him not only as a businessman, but as a leader in the community, and he carried that weight with seriousness. He helped others when he could, giving food or money to those in need, and he expected us to be mindful of the struggles around us. My mother often said that true wealth was measured by how you treated those who had less, and those words have stayed with me throughout my life. At times, I felt the contrast between our life and the lives of others very strongly. When I walked through markets, I saw children my age working hard, their hands rough from labor, their clothes worn thin. I saw mothers who worried about feeding their children and fathers whose faces showed the burden of endless work. These images shaped me, reminding me that our comfort was not something to take for granted. Instead, it was something to respect, to protect, and to use wisely. Looking back, I realized that our wealth shaped not only our lifestyle, but also the way we saw ourselves in the world. It gave us confidence, opportunities, and the chance to grow in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. But it also gave us a responsibility to live with humility, to recognize the humanity in those who had less, and to carry ourselves with dignity. My father often told me that money could be lost in a single day, but the values we carried inside us would last a lifetime. And so, as I remember our wealth and the way it influenced our daily life, I see not only the material comforts, but also the lessons it taught me. It was not just about fine food, good clothing, or a large home. It was about the discipline, the respect, and the perspective that came with it. Those years built the foundation of who I would become, preparing me for the challenges and choices that lay ahead. This foundation of wealth and lifestyle connected directly to how our family was seen in society and how we saw ourselves. But wealth alone was not enough to define us. What truly shaped our family's place in the world was my father himself, his character, his hard work, and the way he built everything we had. Which brings me to the next part of my story. My father's role as a businessman and the man who held our family's fortune together. As I grew older and began to step out into the world, I realized that the true meaning of family was not something I had fully understood in my childhood. Back then, family was simply the people who lived under the same roof, the ones who laughed with me, scolded me, or guided me. It was a structure I took for granted because it was always there, like the air I breathed or the ground beneath my feet. But as life moved forward and new experiences tested my heart and mind, I discovered that family was not just about blood or shared walls. It was about roots, identity, and the very essence of belonging. Family was the invisible thread that tied my life together, even when I could not always see it. One of the first ways I began to see the deeper meaning of family was in the traditions my parents worked so carefully to instill in us. These traditions seemed small at first, simple customs passed down through years of living together, but they carried weight far beyond the walls of our home. For example, every Sunday evening, regardless of the busyness of our week, we gathered around the long oak dining table. My father would sit at the head, my mother beside him, and we children would be lined up, dressed neatly, with eager eyes waiting for the meal. My father always opened with a prayer of gratitude, thanking God for our health, for our abundance, and for each other. At the time, I thought of these gatherings as routine, but as I matured, I realized they were a deliberate effort to bind us as one, to remind us that no matter what we achieved in the outside world, we belonged first and foremost to each other. Family also meant learning how to share not just possessions, but life itself. With 2 brothers and a sister, I had to learn early that the world did not revolve around me. We shared toys, clothes, books, and even space. My sister and I shared a room, and though there were times we fought over who would have the bed closer to the window or whose turn it was to light the candle before sleep, those shared moments became the foundation of our closeness. my brothers, were not always gentle companions. They teased me mercilessly and often left me exasperated. But in those conflicts, I learned patience, forgiveness, and resilience. Later, when I faced challenges with friends or strangers, I realized I had already been trained by my family in the art of compromise and understanding. Perhaps the most profound lesson I learned about family was that it was not always about perfection or peace. Family meant experiencing the full spectrum of human emotions: joy, anger, sorrow, love, and realizing that despite everything, we remained connected. There were days when tempers flared, when my father's stern voice echoed through the hall after we had misbehaved, or when my mother's disappointment cut deeper than any punishment. There were times when my sister's silence hurt me more than her words, or when my brother's carelessness left me in tears. Yet, in every instance, reconciliation followed. We learned to apologize, to forgive, to move on, because family could not afford to stay broken. This cycle of conflict and healing showed me that love was not about never hurting one another. It was about always finding the strength to mend what was broken. When I began to meet people outside of my home, friends, from other families, neighbors, even strangers in the town, I realized not everyone had what I did. Some spoke of absent fathers, others of mothers who were too burdened to show affection. I saw children who longed for the stability I had taken for granted, and it struck me deeply. My family's wealth was not simply in gold or possessions. It was in the unity, the love, and the unwavering bond we shared. This realization humbled me and made me appreciate my upbringing more than I ever had before. It was then I began to understand that family was not about what you had, but about how you held one another up in the face of life's storms. Another aspect of family's meaning came alive when challenges struck us directly. Though my father's business was prosperous, there were times when markets wavered and the weight of uncertainty hung heavy over the household. I remember one particular year when trade had slowed and whispers of loss reached our ears. The mood in the home shifted, and fear crept in, but what stood out most was how we clung tighter to one another. My father reassured us. My mother reminded us that wealth was not the heart of who we were, and we children, though worried, found comfort in their steadiness. That time taught me that family was a shelter, not because it shielded us from hardship, but because it gave us the courage to face hardship together. As I reflect now, I see that family also gave me identity. My father's German heritage and my mother's English roots combined to shape who I was. Their stories, their values, their perspectives became part of me. Family was the lens through which I viewed the world. It influenced how I spoke, how I thought, how I treated others. The respect my father demanded and the compassion my mother showed lived on in me. My siblings' different personalities, my brother's determination, my sister's tenderness, taught me balance. I realized that who I became was not merely the result of my own choices, but the reflection of the family that had poured into me from the beginning. As I grew into adulthood, the meaning of family deepened even further. It was not just about my parents and siblings anymore. It was about the family I would one day create. The lessons I had learned in my home became the blueprint for how I wanted to raise children of my own. I wanted them to know the joy of shared traditions, the safety of unconditional love, and the discipline that builds character. I wanted them to grow up with the understanding that family was their anchor in a changing world. In this way, I saw family as something eternal. What I received from my parents I would pass on to my children, and they, in turn, would carry it into the future. The meaning of family, I came to realize, was also tied to legacy. My father's success was not measured only in his business achievements, but in the kind of family he had nurtured. My mother's impact was not only in her graceful presence, but in the values she instilled in her children. Their legacy lived on in us, and it was our responsibility to honor it. Family was not just about living for ourselves. It was about carrying forward the hopes, dreams, and sacrifices of those who came before us. It was about being part of a story that was larger than any one individual. Now, when I think of my family, I see more than just faces or names. I see a foundation, a legacy, a living testament to the power of love and unity. Family means roots that ground me in wings that allow me to soar. It means having people who know me at my worst and love me anyway. It means knowing that no matter how far I wander, I always have a place where I belong. Family is the mirror that reflects who I was, who I am, and who I strive to be. And so, the meaning of my family is not confined to the walls of my childhood, home, or the memories of the past. It is alive in me today, guiding my choices, shaping my character, and reminding me always that I am part of something greater than myself. My family was my first home, my first teacher, and my lifelong anchor. And in every season of life, when the world feels uncertain, I return to the truth that family is not just a part of life. It is the heart of life itself.